Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, it is the end of the year, 2023, for you time travelers. And rather than put out an interview episode that might get lost during this limbo week or end 2023 with an unround number of shows, I figure our 50th episode of the year should be a story I've been meaning to tell you guys for a while now. So sit back, imagine we're getting a coffee somewhere, and I just start talking and never shut up, and you don't get a word in edgewise, which would not be far from reality. And now, silence. Part 1. This story involves a mild concussion and starts with an altered state of consciousness, but everything I'm telling you happened, even the part about the neighbor and the waitress. At least, it's how I remember it. Also, I am no Spalding Gray, so any literary tropes, symbolism, or other resonance is purely coincidental. That said, silence comes up a few times. So, in case you fix on dates and timelines forensically, like I do, this started the night of October 4th, 2022. Pretty much ends the morning of October 11th, but of course, life's not like that. It stretches in both directions. So, I fasted on Yom Kippur. I'm not religious. I'm just into affliction. That meant no food or water for 25 hours, starting at sunset on the 4th. No internet, no drawing or writing, no contact lenses or bathing, and I avoid my reflection as best I can. Now, my wife, who is not Jewish, is kind enough to let me do my thing and fall out of the imminent world for a day. Most she does is ask if I'm okay, if I want anything special for when I break fast that evening, but she knows I need the silence. So, no phone or Kindle or any devices except my Apple Watch set to Do Not Disturb. That's the only exception I make in order to keep my streak of getting up and walking around a couple of minutes every hour alive. Cut me some slack. Everybody cheats at something, you know? But if you've never disconnected from the world like this, I recommend it. It takes away a lot of distractions. Now, in my case, those distractions included a conference for my pharma trade association that I host and organize and do everything else for. And that was coming up the following Tuesday and Wednesday down in Maryland, October 11th and 12th, if you're calendar compulsive. Now, there's also this set of user fees I was waiting for FDA to issue. And these fees come out every summer, but they were late because of congressional dysfunction and a whole bunch of stories. But the thing is, I worry every year about the size of the fees and that they'll be bigger than I anticipated and projected for my member companies, my clients. And I don't want to irk them by giving them a wrong ballpark figure. They never get irked by this stuff, but I figure that's because of all the time I spend worrying, you know? Like I said, I'm not religious, so I don't go to shul the night of the 4th for Kol Nidre or the 5th for the whole day of prayer and Yizkor and all that stuff. For you non-Jews, Yom Kippur is the end of a 10-day period of prayer and atonement and repentance that begins with Rosh Hashanah. It's the start of the new year, the Jewish calendar, and during that span, so it goes, God decides who to write into the book of life and who gets blotted out if you go for that sort of thing. So instead of doing that, I read, I napped a few times, I took a walk, and I guess you'd say in my own way, I contemplated God or the wonder. I did save a life, which was something. So what did I read? Which I know, of course, you're wondering. I finished Salman Rushdie's memoir, Joseph Anton, the first night. Then I read Gratitude, Oliver Sacks's short collection of essays that he wrote after his terminal cancer diagnosis. Then I read Anatole Broyard's collection of writings after his terminal cancer diagnosis, Intoxicated by My Illness. If you're detecting a trend, it's pretty obvious. This is because after I got diagnosed with a mild form of leukemia in the summer of 2021, I found I was interested in books written by literary figures when they knew they were dying, like Christopher Hitchens' Mortality and Harold Brodke's This Wild Darkness. I've got a small shelf of them, and I thought maybe they'd help me a little with that whole coming to terms with mortality business. And what better day to read them than Yom Kippur, when we're contemplating our place in the book of life. I also read a few essays by Elizabeth Hardwick, whom I'd never really read before, and Jim Woodring's newest graphic novel, One Beautiful Spring Day, as well as the introduction to Robert Hughes's art criticism collection, Nothing If Not Critical. Oh, and I kept up with my one of my annual traditions with Yom Kippur, which is rereading Donald Hall's wonderful essay, One Road. But I actually forgot to do my other great Yom Kippur tradition of recent years, which is to read Bruce J. Friedman's hysterical short story, When You're Excused, You're Excused. So you may be wondering, how'd I get all this reading done in one day? When I say getting off the internet cuts down on a lot of distractions, I'm not lying, friends. Put your phones down, disconnect from everything for a little while, and see what happens. So the other thing I did throughout that day was nap, as I mentioned. I must have taken 3 or 4 of them. It is less about the food when I'm fasting than the lack of water and caffeine. That's what really becomes draining. And sometimes I just conk out. Now, unlike past years when I've done this, the naps were illuminating. I'd be lying in bed during those sort of phase states before real sleep, and I had this sensation, like a vision, I guess, that I was inside myself and exploring the shores of a great lake, charting my interior. I don't mean that figuratively. I mean, that was literally the vision that I had of where I was and what I was doing. And what I found there was myself outside of time. See, as I was exploring, I felt this sense of what I can only call unanxiety, of every moment being the present. And as the day progressed, even out of these nap states, whenever thoughts would arise about work, the conference, the Federal Register announcement about those FDA fees, or my podcast, I found I could just dismiss them easily. I would think, those are in time, and I'm not in time. Of course, I was aware of how many hours were left in the fast, but I wasn't counting minutes, if you get me. Instead, I'd flash back to that vast lake and its shores, and just paddling this canoe of my consciousness. And it reminded me of what I heard a rabbi say once during his Yom Kippur sermon. I know I said I'm not religious, but I used to go to services at Chabad occasionally for the high holidays, okay? He said a reason that we fast on Yom Kippur is because angels neither eat nor drink. And by emulating them for a day, we can get closer to God. And maybe they don't experience time the way we do either. And I was getting a little closer to that through this. And in the afternoon, unable to focus on reading and really just napped out, I took a walk down to the library to drop off that Rushdie memoir. And I noticed something trivially amusing in the new book section. And then I began walking on the trail back to my house when something happened. I found myself beginning to narrate the day to myself, thinking about how I'd tell the story of my interior journey and the books I'd read and the funny little thing that happened in the library. And it hit me in that moment that I was putting myself back in time. Like turning things into a story meant thinking of the future, of how I would shape things and how a listener might respond. And it was a fall from grace is how it felt. Like all the day's communion with that higher self or that primal self or God or the wonder or the angel analog, whatever it was lost in my compulsion to tell a story and maybe get a laugh. And the moment I realized that, I had a sense of something just before me on the trail. I don't mean a figurative, something on the trail of life. I mean, I glanced down on this little wooded trail and I saw this tiny bright orange salamander, maybe like 2 or 3 inches long, just below where I was about to step. And I avoided it in that moment. I stopped to crouch down and look at it, and it was still, I suppose it was afraid to move, having almost been crushed by colossal gill. And I took it in for a few seconds, and then I walked away and thought about how I shouldn't have been able to notice it. What with all the patterns of leaves on the trail floor, and like I said, I hadn't put my contacts in because it was Yom Kippur, so I had my glasses, and that wouldn't have been good for my peripheral vision. But somehow I noticed this little bit of life beneath me in that instant in which I'd kicked myself back off of time's path. I had been lost in the future and the recounting of the past and nearly killed something in the present. And I walked back home and I read more and I broke my fast that evening with a salad that Amy picked up from the local pub. And then I really, really re-entered time. I went online and I saw that Federal Register user fee announcement came through, and I just had to write a briefing email to my clients at 8 o'clock at night. And as it turns out, of course, the fees were just in line with what I projected, nothing that would have bothered them. And there were some minor fires to put out related to my conference. And rather than just letting that timelessness linger, that unanxiety that I had experienced, there I was, just typing away over my little dinner and coffee. The world had kept spinning while I was charting the interior, so, what was I supposed to do? The show must go on and on and on. Part 2. But I hate to tell you, all that was just a preface. I did a little more work that night, and I thought about time and the soul and did a little more reading and got to bed around 9:30, as is my wont. But the next morning I realized something had changed. See, I said this story began the night of October 4th, 2022, but that's not true. It began November 13th, 2019. That's the day my closest friend, Tom Spurgeon, was found dead in his house in Columbus, Ohio. He'd suffered a heart attack on the 11th and died instantly. His girlfriend, Rebecca, not having heard from him in a day plus, went over to check on him, and she found his body. And we held a memorial for Tom in Columbus in December of 2019, and I hosted another one in New York in January 2020. In Columbus, I gave a eulogy that made people cry, including myself. Which does and doesn't explain what happened the morning after my 2022 Yom Kippur fast. The morning of the 6th, I went through my routine, light exercise, black coffee while I iced my knees, postcard of the day. And when I finished all that, and I was putting the postcard in the mailbox at the end of the driveway and putting the flag up, I realized with absolute clarity that I had never come to terms with Tom's sudden death. I had never really mourned him, and I needed to do something about that. So when she got up and was comfortably into her coffee, I said to my wife, I think I need to go to Columbus tomorrow for CXC, and I think I need to do it for Tom so I can start getting past his death. Now, CXC, for you non-comics nerds in the audience, is Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, a comics festival that Tom co-founded in 2015. It's mainly independent and art comics, so not superhero fair exactly, and none of the cosplay you see at the big Comic-Con in San Diego. Tom died a few weeks after the 2019 edition of CXC. That was the last time I had seen him. Because of the pandemic, CXC was canceled in 2020, went virtual in 21, and was going to be in person that weekend. And with Amy's blessing, I started looking up airfares and booking a room at the show hotel, the Levesque. I lined everything up and booked an early flight home on Sunday morning because I was going to have to leave Monday afternoon for my conference in Maryland, and I didn't want to take any chance with flight delays. So people talk about living purposefully or mindfully or whatever, and maybe this is as close as I've ever been to that. See, with my anxiety-driven life, I'm always getting tasks done. But tasks aren't a mission. Even the conference is still a bunch of tasks that all come together, and it all works. But this felt like a mission. Like something with a purpose. Not that I knew what I was going to do when I got to CXC. I mean, you know, my brush with mortality after I turned 50 led me to the conclusion that making the podcast is what I'm here to do. Or at least what I'll be remembered for, you know, if that's what we count as a purpose. And yeah, I'm saying if I'm remembered for anything, it'll be that. But in this moment, that instant at the bottom of my driveway, I understood I had a purpose. I had a mission, and it scared me. I didn't know I knew what to do, and I didn't know what to do about that. So I decided to make it a secret mission. No social media talk, no blabbing to friends about what I was going to do. I didn't want anyone's expectations or words of comfort or encouragement or remarks about how they wished I went to another comics festival that had been held a few weeks earlier. Coincidentally, that other festival, the Small Press Expo, it's at the same hotel where I hold my pharma conference. And I didn't want to be public. I didn't want to mourn publicly. That was the point of this. Like I'd already done the public part at Tom's memorial and at the other one, both memorials that we did, but that somehow wasn't what was in my heart. And I don't want you to think I was in denial about losing him. I mean, I understood he was dead and gone, but at the same time, for a couple of years now, most nights when I took our dog Bendico out on his end of the evening constitutional, I would just look up at the night sky and think about Tom, missing him and thinking about what I wished we could still talk about. I know that's not necessarily a bad thing. You want to hold on to the memories, but I'm so unaccustomed to loss, I don't really know what we're supposed to do. All I knew was I was unsettled. And I'm not going to go into stories about Tom or the details of our friendship because we would be here even longer. I'll just say that it began with comics, basketball, and Tom Stoppard, and grew from there. So I let Rebecca know, Tom's girlfriend at the time of his death. She had taken on a larger role at CXC after Tom was gone, and she'd begun to move forward with her life without him. And I also told Tom's great friend Eric, who was going to be at CXC also. And I filled in my closest friend and confidant from work, Cornell. I don't mean we're just work friends. He's become one of the closest people in my life, but he's also on my board of trustees. So that's why I mentioned work. And so with those plans in place, I took care of work on Thursday into Friday morning, all the conference planning and all the other stuff that has to get done. And then I took my afternoon flight from Newark to Columbus that Friday. And my chest was tight from the moment I woke up that morning. I mean, I've never done anything like this before. But from that moment on Thursday, I knew this is what I have to do. But I mean, you got to understand, I am not given to impulsive behavior. My anxiety leads to over planning and micromanaging, not dropping everything and hopping a flight when I've got a big conference looming, not, flying into the unknown. And trust me, it was unknown. And it wasn't fear that I was doing the wrong thing, but more of a dread of what was awaiting me in Columbus. That's what I didn't know. And Columbus and I, we got a history. Besides going to CXC 4 years in a row and it being the last place I saw Tom, the first time I went to Columbus was to record a podcast with D.G. Myers, a literature professor who was dying of cancer. And we recorded in the spring of 2014, and at the time, he thought he had about 2 years left. And we spent hours together that Sunday. We recorded for a while, but then we just talked off mic for quite a bit. And he admitted he was going to be knocked out afterwards, but he was so enjoying the conversation. And I felt guilt that anybody who knows the end is near would spend hours blabbing with me, but he did. And he didn't have 2 years left, as it turned out. He died 6 months later instead, during Rosh Hashanah. So, what was awaiting me in Columbus? As it turns out, the immediate answer to that is a dwarf. On my walk through the airport to the taxi stand, there was a dwarf coming the other way. And we were both masked up. And he made eye contact with me, and he nodded as we passed, and I nodded back. And I wondered if I had just landed in a 90s indie movie or a David Lynch thing or something. It was a strange start. And I would stay masked up most of the weekend, so just keep that in mind when you're visualizing anything that takes place during this whole episode. See, at that point, I'd never had COVID, and if I had to skip my own conference because I had impulsively traveled to a comics festival, well, my clients would have understood, that's Gil, but I would not have been able to live it down, frankly. So masks on pretty much the whole time I was around people. So I grabbed a cab to get to the Levesque, to the hotel, and I texted Rebecca that I had arrived. And she texted back that I should get to the opening event at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum on the OSU campus. I should get to the Billy as soon as I could. And I told her I'd do my best. The Billy is, they have the opening ceremony there. It's also where we held the memorial service for Tom in December 2019. It's a wonderful building, great museum. If you're into comics and cartooning at all, you should go visit and go on the tour. Anyway, you can look that stuff up after. But in the taxi from the airport, the anxiety or panic or whatever we're going to call it got even worse. I kept asking myself what the heck I was doing there, why I couldn't just talk to a therapist or let things go like a normal person. I was unraveling, honestly. And then, I swear to God this happened, we passed an exit ramp where there were a bunch of election signs up that all read, Gil, in giant white letters on a red background. And I thought, well, man, you wanted a sign, and that's pretty literal, but take it. And I looked it up when I got home. Luis Gil was running for a county commissioner seat. A month later, he'd lose almost 2-1, but, he was a Republican. Still, it was a sign. And I got to the hotel, and I discovered that Rebecca had gotten my room upgraded, dropped my bags, cleaned up quickly, changed masks, ordered a lift to the Billy Ireland, where CXC was kicking off, and there I went. And my heart kept pounding. I got out of myself a little by talking with the Lyft driver. He heard there was a comic show in town, wanted to know about it, so I became cartooning ambassador Gil while my panic was waiting for me. And I wondered what I was afraid of, crying in front of a bunch of cartoonists, or, being honest that I was hurting, or spontaneous combustion. I don't know. Sometimes, like now, I'm afraid that the telling will kill the feeling, if you get me. The putting it into words and trying to share it with another person, whatever it is, will make it worthless, will make me numb. I was maybe afraid that telling people about what I went through and about losing Tom would make it all glib or turn it into a bit, So the lobby of the Billy Ireland was packed when I got there. Rebecca was up on the landing of the stairs to the second floor, mic in hand, presenting the Tom Spurgeon Award. It's for non-cartoonists who've made a contribution to the form of comics, as Tom did throughout his career. And she had been crying, and I could tell that the moment I saw her as I got in. And she gave the award to Frederick L. Schott, a translator and manga scholar. And again, masked up, I made my way through the crowded floor. And Ken Fisher, who makes the cartoon Tom the Dancing Bug under the pen name Reuben Bowling, he noticed me right away and said hello. And he seemed to get something was up with me, but he didn't know my whole thing. And to be fair, we barely knew each other. We met in passing at a few festivals before the pandemic, but when we finally got to record a podcast together, it had to be remote. So we never got that communion that I feel comes from two people sitting at a table, having a conversation and reading each other's faces, which I've said a million times on the podcast, but it's true. There's something that happens there that doesn't happen over the internet, So the award presentation ended. The reception, broke up, turned into a general gab fest. There's food and drink upstairs. Everybody was gathering, and I walked over, and Rebecca and I hugged, and I apologized for missing her speech about Tom. I also got a hug from Eric, even though I was just reaching out for a handshake. They both understood, better than I did, what I was going through, and what I needed. But they had people to see and so much going on, and I headed over to the little room off the lobby where during CXC, the Billy Ireland people display original comic art. So I went in there to just look at the pages and get away from the crowd a little. It's only, maybe a dozen people in there usually. But after a few moments of trying to lose myself in these beautiful black and white pages and taking in the art and seeing the people I'd recorded with in the past and other people I'd never met, or people whose comics I'd worshipped and enjoyed for years, I was hyperventilating. Whatever I was afraid of was getting nearer, or I was getting nearer to it. And I sat down on a chair in the corner of that smaller room, and I looked around and realized no one saw anything amiss. Even though I was crawling out of my skin, everybody's there for their own world and their own lives, and no one's saying, "Who? Well, that poor guy in the mask and the crazy hair, he must be having a crisis." But I felt compelled in that moment to go upstairs and to go to the big lecture room where we held Tom's memorial. And at this point, I was shaking. I was up there, and the last time I was outside this door to this room, I had my arm around a cartoonist who was having an anxiety attack. He had made the trip from New York to come to the memorial, but he couldn't bring himself to walk in the door. He was so broken up. So I gave him some strength so we could mourn Tom together. And we walked through that doorway back in 2019, and he almost turned around again when he saw the urn on a table alongside some mementos and photos of Tom. But I told him we could do this, and we could do this together. And we did. But this time, I was alone, and I didn't know what was behind that door. And I was about to reach out for the handle when someone called my name. And I looked back down the hall towards the reception area, and there was a guy in a festival volunteer T-shirt. They had, I think, teal T-shirts that year with a big CXC logo and all. And he walked over and introduced himself. And his name was familiar, but I couldn't place it exactly. But Tom had introduced us years ago, and he listens to the podcast, and he's been a follower of mine since then on, of all places, Strava, the social media platform for runners and fitness freaks. And that's where I realized I knew his name from. And he asked how I was doing. And he said he didn't know I was coming to the festival this year. And I told him I didn't know either until yesterday. And then I started to tell him about Tom and what happened. And I just started crying. So, as it turns out, my maybe fear of crying in front of a bunch of cartoonists was actually crying in front of a cartooning festival volunteer I barely knew. But there I was, just bawling away to someone I didn't know about what was really happening inside me. But he was understanding. He didn't know Tom as well as I did, but he recognized that coming here must have been tough for me. And I regathered myself after the downpour, and we talked for a little bit. He wondered what Tom would have made of the world of COVID and lockdowns and all the cultural events that Tom would have had a unique perspective on. And then we talked about wrestling and football and the Indiana Pacers and things that mattered to Tom and things we shared through our friendship and our love of him. And then Ken Fisher, that cartoonist from earlier in the lobby, he came down the hall. I have to say, in all likelihood, to check on me, like he wondered if I was okay. And I filled him in on my whole situation. It was a little easier this time than a few minutes before. And I apologize in advance if I became an emotional wreck in the next minute or at any other time that weekend. I told both of them, but just like with the show volunteer and just like me for that other cartoonist back in 2019, Ken was there to help too. And the funny thing was, my heart felt unburdened in that moment. And I didn't even notice it until later when I was taking a 3-mile walk back to the hotel. But all that tension dissipated just from letting my heart crack in front of people I didn't know, but who cared. And I wondered if I felt this relief, this sense of peace, because I was sharing a real moment with people, or if this was just performative grief where I was just denuding these feelings, numbing myself by putting things into words. And that is the fun about being a creature of anxiety and self-doubt, let me tell you. And after talking with Ken and the volunteer, I socialized with a bunch of cartoonists and other pals of mine at the Billy reception before that 3-mile walk back to the Levesque, where I took in the night air and tried to remember if I was going to pass through a bad neighborhood on the way there or not. I didn't. Part 3. I gave myself a concussion overnight. I went to the bathroom in the dark, remembering the layout of the hotel suite pretty well, but forgetting the configuration of the bathroom door. It's too complicated to describe, but basically, I cracked my forehead on the door handle while sitting down on the toilet, which I know sounds terrible, but it left me with this thumbnail-long gash over my right eye and some blood and a bump, as well as a concussed dizzy feeling that lasted all weekend and left me terrified of taking a nap lest I die in my sleep from a subdural hematoma. So that is how Saturday morning was shaping up, while my true secret mission awaited me. Martin Amis tells a story about his dad near the end of his bad final novel, Inside Story. Kingsley Amis goes to the town of Hull, or the city of Hull, for the funeral of his best friend, Philip Larkin. And when he gets back, he tells Martin that he'd never actually gone to Hull in all those years, and that his whole relationship with Larkin took place in London or by letters and phone calls. And as he sees Hull and Larkin's home and all these people Larkin knew who weren't literary figures, he realizes he never really knew his closest friend. And that's how I felt about Tom after the Columbus Memorial back in 2019, when all these friends from different parts of his life told stories about these other aspects of him. Role-playing game Tom, youth group Tom, college football Tom, seminary Tom, music-loving Tom. Even comics Tom had a bunch of different incarnations. And I thought about what a terrible friend I was, and how I should have asked more questions and learned more about the parts of his life that weren't mine. And I mean, I do that with podcast guests every week, but I never asked him the questions that might have opened up our friendship even further. He meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and I was embarrassed I didn't look beyond my own horizons for that. Ashamed, maybe. And this is how I tell you that I have a little something in common with Kingsley Amis. Besides not liking several of Martin Amis's novels, I had never been to my best friend's home. In the 20-something years Tom and I had known each other, I had never set foot in any place where he lived. Like any house, or apartment. It made sense when he lived off the beaten path in Silver City, New Mexico. I never traveled out there, but I visited him in Seattle. I made multiple trips to Columbus and never visited his home. And I will tell you, to my shame, it's because I was afraid. I was afraid Tom lived in the sort of obese comic book guy's junk food squalor that would have made me look at him differently. I don't want to say repulsed me, but, on that gut level, yeah. And I'm not proud of this, but I think it's why I avoided ever bringing up a visit to his place, and maybe why he avoided ever inviting me. That concern that I'd come off like Felix Unger, despite the varying degrees of lived-in squalor in my own setup. And Tom stayed with us numerous times over the years. But fear and a misplaced sense of propriety mangle my life. Places matter to me, and I'm ashamed not to have taken in Tom's home to situate him in an actual place, not just a virtual presence or a self-walking comics festivals and the dinners we would go out to, but a home. And I thought that part of my unresolvedness over his death was because I wasn't close enough to his life. So my real mission, the real reason I went out there, was to go to Tom's home. That's what I knew from the beginning. That's what I had to do. I don't know. I put on my suit Saturday morning, cleaned this gash on my forehead. I packed my drawing gear, and I called a lift. And the morning was cold, and I wore Tom's scarf. Rebecca had given it to me at the 2019 memorial. It was a present she gave him, and she knew I'd give it a good home. It's this thin, gray cashmere Brunello Cucinelli. It feels like heaven. I just had very few occasions to wear it since lockdowns and no real events to go to. But I brought it with me for this trip. It was a last-minute grab, but anyway, the driver dropped me off at the top of Tom's street, and I walked down this tree-lined suburban street to Tom's last known address. And the place was nothing special to see. One floor plus basement and an attic, off-white vinyl siding, stone face front, brick chimney on the side, concrete patio off the door, a couple of chairs and a love seat on the patio, blue and white striped awning over the patio. Front door was blue. I took a few pictures, and then I stood in the street and tried to draw it. Because drawing is something I took up 2021 after Tom's death, but it's something I discovered. It taught me how to see, and I thought maybe trying to draw this in the moment would give me something. So I made a couple of sketches, and I was in the middle of one when the next door neighbor came out. He was a white guy in his 30s, tattoos, sweatpants, tank top, despite the cold. Kind of meth headish, to be honest. And he eyed me suspiciously, wondering why there was a guy standing here next door to his house drawing away. And I walked across the street to him, and I held up the pad and explained, my best friend lived here, and he died a few years ago, and I'd never been to see him while he was alive, and felt this would be a way of trying to achieve some sort of peace and really get to understand how my friend lived. And he kept looking at me, and I started to tell him about my sense of shame about all this, and really, again, unburden myself without crying this time, but, sort of just getting out why I was there in that moment, what this whole mission was. And he just shook his head and pointed at his ear, and then he began signing at me, and I realized he was stone deaf. And that the one person I really filled in on this whole thing, the one guy I explained my whole secret mission to, had no idea what I was saying. So I gave him a thumbs up and walked back into the street and returned to drawing, and he walked back into the house, and that was that. After that, I walked down the street a little, and I tried to commune with Tom. I apologized for never visiting and tried to strike a different tone than those nightly addresses when I would leave the house with Benny, when I would look up at the stars while he was sniffing for a tree to pee on. And so instead of saying, Tom, I wish you were still here, or I miss you, I tried talking about my life since his death. And, not just, I wish we did X, or I wish I hadn't done Y, but I talked about drawing and leukemia, and finally putting out a zine, and how weird lockdown was, and the people I've gotten to meet since, and what he might have thought of them, and who I wish he could have gotten to meet. But all of that was less of a relief than I hoped for. Maybe, because I'd already freed my heart the night before, or maybe because of my concussion. I don't know. But I called another Lyft, and I got back to the hotel and dropped off some stuff. And then I walked over to Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, to CXC, which was just starting up at the Columbus Public Library. And the main floor where CXC takes place has dozens of tables of cartoonists and publishers and some retailers and other exhibitors. And this is my first comics festival since 2019. And I walked the floor a couple of times, got to see some old friends and make some new ones, and buy some comics. And other people gave me some comics, and I had some of my zines with me, so I gave those out. And I discovered that I have more podcast listeners than I know, apparently. I was happy to see so many people. Talking got me out of myself a little, but also just, I was thrilled that CXC was crowded. Even though I was masked up and afraid of getting COVID, I was glad that so many people were coming back to the show that Tom helped build. It meant something to me that it would last after him. And I also told a couple of people about my head injury, let them know if I'm found dead in my hotel room during the weekend, they should let the police know it was not drug related, just a bathroom injury to check for, subdural hematoma or something. But then then this thing happened. I met with one of the organizers of CXC. I was sitting at the table of an older cartoonist. I helped her move her stuff around. She's in her 80s and shouldn't have been hauling boxes. So I had a kindness of my heart, did that for her. Then I kind of sat at her booth while she was doing a signing at another table. And this CXC organizer came up to me, and he was a younger guy, very good friend of Tom's. In fact, named his newborn after Tom. I think the kid was born a little bit after Tom's death. And he said he wasn't expecting to see me, but was really glad I came to the festival because he knew what Tom and I meant to each other, and he was very happy I was there. And I told him I was here for Tom and was about to elaborate and maybe go through my whole shtick again and strip it of yet more meaning. When, son of a bitch, if he doesn't start telling me exactly what I was going to tell him, that the public memorial in 2019 was great. It brought a lot out. It helped us all mourn Tom collectively, but he didn't feel that he'd really mourned Tom yet. And he thought it was because we've been in pandemic world crisis mode since just a couple of months after Tom's death, and he'd never been able to slow down and just grieve for his friend. And, my embarrassment, I'd never even thought along those lines. I was taking everything just as the internal, not thinking about, everything else in the world and how it mitigated against this too. And this was somebody who knew Tom and had been to his home and was part of his life in Columbus, and he felt the same way. And I told him, I'm not happy that you're suffering the way I am, but I'm happy that you're suffering the way I am. I mean, here I was thinking my problem with letting Tom go was regret that I wasn't close enough or not in the right way, or because I never really knew this last stage of his life in Columbus. And here was someone who knew all that stuff, and he was in the exact same boat I was. And he knew what I was saying, and he saw this year's CXC as a celebration of Tom, a way of honoring him that he hoped would help him get through his private grief. And we traded stories after that for a while and promised to stay in touch in hopes, it might help us both let him go without letting him go, And I thought about all I'd been keeping inside and how I should have reached out with something more than emails or DMs to mutual friends or podcast monologues. That I should have just talked to someone and talked to the people who knew him and heard what they were going through, not just radiating what I was going through. And after the exhibit hall closed for the day, I went back to my room at the Levesque and I wrote down some notes about the day and decided to go to the hotel restaurant for dinner rather than try to connect with friends. I've been through a lot, and I needed the quiet of a crowded room where nobody knew me. And they sat me at the bar area since I was solo. And this young art goth waitress brought me a menu, and she said, "Hi, my name is Silence, and I'll be serving you tonight." I'm sorry, Silence? And she nodded and told me she'd be back for my order. And I looked over the menu and came to some decisions. And I made some quick sketches at the bar. And when she came back, I asked her if she knew the Auguste Priol sculpture called Silence. I showed her a picture of it I took at the Art Institute of Chicago. I had drawn it, Yom Kippur, maybe 2020. Could have been 21. No, it had to be 21 when I started, after I started taking up drawing. Anyway, in case you don't know this piece, here is a description from the Art Institute's site. Auguste Priault created this roundel, a composition with a circular format, for the tomb of Jacques Robel in Père Lachaise, a Parisian cemetery. Departing from more conventional, comforting funerary imagery of the period, portraits of the deceased or melancholy images of mourning, Priault instead modeled a stark evocation of death. Here, a frail finger is raised to the lips of a deeply shrouded and skeletal face with heavy-lidded eyes, perhaps marking the frontier between life and death. The sculpture met with immediate acclaim upon its first exhibition and became an icon of Romanticism. She'd never seen it. And when she saw my sketchbook, little notepad sketchbook sort of thing, she asked if I was an artist and whether I was here for the comics show. I told her I draw a little, but I'm not a cartoonist, but was here for the show. And she said she was an artist too, but no, I am pretty much past my art school girl of doom fixation, so I let it go. Oh, we didn't talk much after. She lived up to her name. But I went back to my room, and I kept writing about the day, wrote a long letter to one of my oldest friends who I'd recently regained contact with. Some of the notes of that are here, but I packed up my pretty scant gear, and I got ready for an early night so I could get to the airport on time for Sunday's flight home. And around 9 o'clock, a friend texted me to say a whole bunch of people were getting together in another suite and sharing stories about Tom, and they would love for me to come by. And I was torn because it could have helped me even more to hear about Tom and how other friends have coped with his loss. But I knew, I might get back into that performative grief mode and tell this story again and already start tailoring it to accentuate whatever transformation I pretended I was going through. But the bigger thing is, I knew if I went, I'd be up all night. And that meant I would be bleary throughout Sunday and the trip home, and that potentially will put me in mistake-making mode on Monday when I had to get everything together and head down to my conference. Because that's how I think. Even when it comes to a situation that would probably be good for me, I still try to plan 3 or 4 steps ahead. When I tell you why this weekend was so strange for me. Well, there you go. I mean, it probably would have been smart for me to stay up anyway, given the concussion and the potential for dying in my sleep, but I passed on the get-together. I went to bed, didn't die, got a lift to the airport, and headed into Sunday. And when I arrived, when my lift got there, car right ahead of me was also a lift. The passenger got out the same time I did, and it was the comedian David Koechner. And he was tall, wearing black jeans and a black shirt and a white cowboy hat. And unlike the dwarf, on Friday, we didn't nod at each other. And I thought maybe I'd shifted from, David Lynch movie to Judd Apatow movie over the weekend. But that was it. The flight was easy, and so was the drive. And then I was home, and my heart was lighter. And I told my wife I'd fill her in on everything sometime, but I never really did. So, Amy, you can listen to this and get the whole story. Part 4. Of course, I didn't die in my sleep, and the bump in my forehead was starting to recede, and I still had that conference ahead of me. I spent Monday morning in this new state doing final prep, drove down to Maryland that afternoon, and it was a long trip with a ton of traffic, but I had this whole flood of experiences and reflections to keep me company, to wonder how I would relate all this without killing it. And went out to dinner with a couple of my clients Monday night. Tuesday morning, Tuesday was the conference, but it began at noon, and I learned when I got down to the general area where we're going to hold it that another event was going on in the morning, so I wouldn't be able to do setup until 11. And that was fine for the amount of time I was going to need, but not great, given the anxiety that was going to preoccupy me for the next few hours as I tried to host an in-person conference for the first time since 2019 and juggle everything that could go wrong. And, at least being down there and doing something would have helped. But no go. I was going to have to sit around in my hotel room. So instead, I decided to drive over to the warehouse location of Second Story Books and just lose myself among the used books for a while. And I took a wrong turn, but the GPS straightened me out, and on that reroute, I passed this hole-in-the-wall Mexican restaurant, which is where I had my last meal with Tom. See, remember back when I told you how the Small Press Expo is held in the same hotel as my pharma conference? Well, during SPX in September of 2019, about 2 months before Tom died, he and I we would always go to dinner during SPX, and we were trying to find a place to take our pal, the great cartoonist Eddie Campbell. And somehow we stumbled across this place. I think Tom knew it, and or at least he'd looked up a couple of good places that cartoonists don't go, so we could find somewhere peaceful during SPX. And rather than tell you the story, here's what I said about that last dinner at Tom's memorial in 2019. Our cartoonist guest was Eddie Campbell. Those of you who are not comics people, Eddie is this Scottish-Australian cartoonist who did these wonderful autobiographical comics, as well as a whole series about Bacchus in the modern age. But his autobiographical, and both sides of his strips have always had this life wisdom aspect to them. And getting to know him in recent years, I've picked up a little of his wisdom, I think. But during the dinner, he talked about bucket lists and why he thought the whole concept of a bucket list was humbug, we'll say, because there are kids in the crowd, BS. That you can't take those experiences with you. When you jump out of a plane because you found out you've had a terminal diagnosis, when things are, you're going to do something absolutely crazy, go to the end of the world, none of that goes with you when you die. And what Eddie said was, if he was facing the end, he just want to walk his dog one more time and watch another sunset. And I think Tom and I both agreed with that. I don't remember too much of the dinner otherwise, but that's the thing that stuck out. It was about a few weeks before his death, middle of September. 3 years later, the place had closed down from the looks of it. I guess a victim of lockdown, like so many restaurants and people. And I drove on to the bookstore, and in the parking lot, in silence, I thought about that evening with Tom and Eddie and the memorial so soon after. And I thought about how terrible it would have been for me to see that restaurant right before my conference and to have that last dinner and my unresolved memories of Tom and all of that unsettledness, that pent-up trauma or grief swirling in my head and aching in my heart if I hadn't gone to Columbus that weekend, and if I hadn't cried to a stranger, and if I hadn't told my story to a deaf man, and if I hadn't woken up transformed one morning after a fast. If. And I walked through Second Story for a while. It's this big warehouse, lots of aisles of books. I'd never been. And my friend Cornell, who's I mentioned at the beginning that friend from work, as I put it, a huge book freak, also a collector. And so, we've always talked about going to Second Story at some point. I hope we'll get to. But this time I was by myself. But I bought some books by Donald Hall and Judith Thurman. And I talked to the clerk about ballet because of a funny anecdote that had happened to me that turned into a story from his youth. And well, the pharma conference, it went fine. It was stressful. A bunch of little things went wrong, but, it was nothing I couldn't handle. Tom would have been proud. Or he would have put up with me while I blathered on about it, I guess. that is a wrap on 2023. Thanks to all of this year's guests and everyone who listened or read my newsletter or otherwise helped support what I do with the Virtual Memories Show, or just made art for themselves, or did something that just keeps culture alive, man. I got some great guests lined up for next year, as well as an art project that I hope to build from my in-person episodes, which is a weird little thing to bring up, or a strange little hint of something. I won't say any more until it progresses, but I've got a model in mind and something I think that's will be another direction to take things. I hope you will be here for it. Thank you if you stuck around this long. Thank you for listening to this story. If you're a friend of Tom's, share your experiences with me. Let me know if you've been able to let him go. If you've had trouble with other losses in your life, I hope you get something from this, that you also figure out that just talking to someone can help. And I want to thank all of you for being part of my life. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.